Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks a lot for, or good morning, depending where you are. Thanks a lot for joining. We're still just waiting for, I see the people are just joining. So we'll wait a little bit, 30 seconds more. Really great to see so many people on this Wednesday afternoon. Let me just see if, how many more. In the meantime, maybe I'll start with some housekeeping rules. So my name is Edith Kiss. I'm co-chairing this working group, CPIC Biodiversity Working Group with Frank Hawkins, who is also here. And we have some great speakers lined up for a good, hopefully interactive session today. We have a very packed agenda. So we set aside 1.5 hours this time. We only had an hour last time during the previous session at the semi-annual meeting in January. So hopefully we'll have enough time to dive deeply into some of the topics and also to have a Q&A. We have a lot of people and I think it's still trickling in. So unfortunately we won't be able to make this session participative in the sense that people come online and ask questions, but we would really encourage you to use the chat function. Please, first of all, if you can rename yourself, if you haven't done yet, with your name and organization, that's very helpful. And also feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, where you are from. And also we'd love to hear what's the angle, what's the interest for you in particular, whether it's on the investor side, developer side, buy side, sell side. So happy to hear, see where the participation is coming from, and what you would like to get out of the meeting as well. What are the interests of questions? So we'll try to address them. So I'm gonna go, let's see. So in terms of the agenda for today, again, we have several speakers. So we'll kick off with some updates, or first of all, an introduction on CPIC for those of you who are less familiar with. Typically, this is a CPIC members only meeting, but due to the high interest, we also welcomed some of the non-members. If you want to become a member, very happy to provide information on that. And we'll also have some updates in our next upcoming future sessions. So please stay until the end. I will do a quick update on what's happening on the market, where we see interesting trends and what to watch out for, and some activities we are engaging within the CPIC working group. And after that, we'll have a presentation from Prescott from the Biodiversity Consultancy around ecosystem metrics, and in particular related to the ongoing VERA framework work on the new methodologies and new standard. We will also hear from Frank around the nature positive framework and how that relates in the big picture, how developments on what IUCN and others are doing. Then we'll hear from Jeremy Eppel from Nature Finance around some of the updates, that's the most recent developments in the market from Paris, and also their work at Nature Finance on the biodiversity credits. And thanks a lot, Jeremy, again for the last minute substitution for Dorothy, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. And then finally, we'll hear, we will discuss about the biodiversity impact credits. We have two speakers, Stuart, Clenaghan and Paul Smith from the Botanical Gardens Conservation International, which has been published recently, and a very interesting a new methodology for a type of biodiversity credits. So you will have a deep dive and hopefully a lot of interesting questions we can delve into. And again, at the end, we'll have a Q&A with all the speakers, so we can also have your questions at the end. But also, again, feel free to send the questions along during the presentations, and we'll try to address that. So with that, I leave a quick word for Frank to introduce CPIC.
Hello, everybody. Very good to see you all there. Great to have such active participation. Welcome in particular to CPIC members, but also to guests here who I hope will be able to enhance their interest and support in CPIC as a result of this call. So just a word about CPIC first. CPIC is a global community of practitioners around the issue of conservation finance, focusing obviously particularly on the private sector investment side. And the goal of CPIC is to increase the pipeline of deals that support conservation, but generate returns in addition to that. It was launched at the IUCN World Conservation Congress in Hawaii in September 2016. And since that time, we've been developing model investment frameworks called blueprints that demonstrate how it is that successful deals have been formulated, what kinds of financial structures are involved, what kinds of supplemental risk management structures are needed, how you can support individual developers to get to the point of investability, all those things. And we're also producing regular reports on the state of conservation finance, the state of different market components. This is a particular working group of CPIC, the CPIC working group on biodiversity credits, where we've had, I think, 3 or 4 sessions now, reflecting the great interest there is in biodiversity credits from the, particularly, I would say, from the developer perspective, but also from the investor side, who are looking for ways to channel finance into conservation. Please do, if you are not already a member of CPIC, please do have a look on the website, cpicfinance.com, and sign up. The strength of CPIC is in its great array of members. We have 120 plus members now from the conservation sector, from the developer intermediary section, from the institutional investors, from standard setters, from a whole range of different places. And the reason, the raison d'etre of CPIC is to provide that community with support in understanding how the process of conservation finance is working. So thank you very much. I'll pass you back to Edith.
Thanks a lot, Frank. And just again, before we continue, a quick reminder, this is under Chatham House rules. And if you are interested in the slides, feel free to reach out to Danielle afterwards. We can distribute them. So don't need to take that much notes. So starting with some quick market update. Basically, we looked at the last session as well, but obviously lots of exciting developments after the CBD COP last year, and even since January, lots of things happening. So we try to provide some summary, by no means being comprehensive, but just some of the highlights we are to watch out for in this very highly fast evolving market. On the market side, one of the notable the transaction happened in Sweden under the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, developed the methodology for a while, and a pilot already been done, and the first batch of biodiversity credits have been sold to a Swedish bank. So that's quite interesting to see already pilot transactions happening in the market. Demand side demand side is a very important topic, obviously, and a critical building block of this market. It's something that we are obviously looking at with great interest, but there is much more activity happening on that side with the VEF and others. Again, within the CPIC membership, we more tend to focus more on the supply side of the equation, looking at what's happening on the ground and how we can encourage pilots. But again, good to see these transactions already emerging. There has been also some news from the GEF on the new fund, which was established during the last Kunming-Montreal COP, the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund, that will be formally launched in August. So that's, I think, also of great interest, how this new fund will be capitalized and what sort of funding it will provide for pilot activities. I think that remains quite interesting to see. On the more like around the research and knowledge side of the market, interesting to see from UNDP this new biodiversity finance resource database. If you haven't seen that, called FIRE, very nice name, Finance Resource Database for Biodiversity. Quite interesting to, again, listing over 200 funds and funding mechanisms. Funding for biodiversity credits and more broadly nature-based solutions beyond carbon still remains challenging. So I think it's very useful to see what are the funds, who are the funds, public, private, philanthropic and commercial, that are already engaging in this emerging market. Also noted that with the CDC Biodiversity, which is French institution, who already had a business for positive biodiversity club since 2016, but more recently within this club launched a dedicated biodiversity credit working group and started to do some ecosystem mapping, which is something that I'll talk about, that we also planning to do. And the last webinar is available. I found quite interesting to see the work they have been doing. I think it's a paid membership organization, but yeah, maybe for some of the French stakeholders could be an interesting place to also join and get more information on. Again, on the market side, more broadly, the B0, interesting to see some of the ratings agencies from the carbon sector, like B0, getting involved and organize the biodiversity conference here in London, where I'm based. And there are some public, after the takeaways, and the recordings are also available. So again, a lot of knowledge generation discussions are ongoing. And coming on more the regulatory side and government side, and we'll hear more about this most recent meeting in Paris, where the UK and the French governments launched a global roadmap for high integrity biodiversity credits, and also launched this new multi-stakeholder advisory panel. And we'll hear more from Jeremy on how this is shaping up and what we can expect there. I also noted just some of the UK activities with the DEFRA and the UK standards to UK national standards body that have in March announced a new nature investment standards program to stimulate again the nature markets framework here in the UK. And finally, something that we are obviously keeping an eye on, a very close eye on, is the SBTN, the Science Based Targets Network, which is the equivalent of SBTI for nature, which is coming up with now these new methods for companies for nature positive targets. And it's already being piloted by 17 firms for ecosystem restoration, freshwater use, and freshwater pollution. So some of the metrics are emerging, not yet the ones on species or biodiversity, but interesting to see. And certainly we believe that together this with TNFD remain some important forces behind the emergence of this new market. And in terms of, again, what we're trying to see how CPIC can help stimulate the marketplace and encourage more activities, we are engaging on a mapping exercise, also an ecosystem mapping exercise, given how complex this ecosystem is, and how many new methodology standards are emerging. We do encourage all the members as well. If you know any additional ones we should be paying attention to, please submit it either via the chat or afterwards. Very happy to take it into account of our kind of assessment or research. So this slide just summarizes kind of a first attempt to categorize and make this mapping exercise, whereby obviously, again, as I mentioned, from the top down, we're looking at TNFD, SBTN, and then this new UK and French roadmap, and obviously other and the CBD COP and other driving forces, but where the demand side and regulation is coming, and at the bottom up, we are in close coordination with the Biodiversity Credit Alliance that has been launched after the COP, the VEF working group, as I mentioned, CDC, and then our working group, so the CPIC one. So we also obviously coordinating with the different working groups to see how we can have a harmonized approach. And we're looking at categorizing or seeing how the market is emerging and self-organizing around the international standards. These are the ones, some of them are we know from the carbon space, obviously, like the FSC that has been around for a long time and has had its ecosystem services procedures and certification around since 2021. Gold Standard has its own SDG certification, which obviously includes biodiversity. Plan Vivo has been one of the first ones. We had a dedicated session last year before they launched a public consultation on their PV nature. I think it's wrapping up the consultation, and hopefully will be published soon the first methodology that is looking at a 1% uplift and a basket of metrics to quantify that. Vera is still under the works, and again we'll hear more on that from Graham. There is the Organization for Biodiversity Certification in France that together with Carbon 4 has published also a paper earlier this year, and the methodology looking around biodiversity index assessment and looking at the carrying capacity. So they have their own methodology, proposing their own methodology for that. We have seen the Global Biodiversity Standard emerge, and under which the Biodiversity Impact Credit, which we'll hear from Stuart and Paul more. The Region Registry, which is looking at a tokenized approach for species, and already under development by a Brazilian developer for a species methodology there. So it's so interesting to see. I think it's also under public consultation if you are interested. And then we see also some of the new carbon standards like Ecosystem Restoration Standard, who is just also finished public consultation that has a very high focus on biodiversity assessment and biodiversity baselining, which again is very interesting. And we certainly want to encourage and see the holistic approach between carbon and biodiversity crediting rather than working silos. So very interesting to see that. In the middle box, we have national standards emerging from again what we have seen, and by no means this is comprehensive, and it's going to get very crowded very soon if we take all the national ones. But some of the ones to mention: the Swedish one, because we are already seeing transactions, the Australian nature repaid bill, and some transactions going through that at I think around a few dollars, quite low prices reported. Terrasos has been pioneering the voluntary biodiversity credits, and many transactions going through, so there is quite a lot of data around that available, and the UK Nature Investments Program that I already mentioned before. So yeah, national standards are emerging, and by all means we need the domestic markets and also the domestic compliance markets, which is outside of the scope. I haven't included here BNG and the biodiversity net gain and other compliance mechanisms, which are also of interest obviously, and has a close links to what we're doing in the voluntary space. And then finally, the developer pilots, which I think is also super interesting to see, especially how those pilots will be linking up hopefully to some of the new methodologies or creating new ones from the bottom up. There are just a few mentioned here, like Rebalance Earth, Value Nature, Pivotal, and Credit Nature, that are all working on different metrics. Some of them are species-based, technology-based, some is tokenized, more like the tokenized end of the spectrum, and some more in the habitat. So a little bit differences, and I think for different habitats, different ecosystems, so different proposals are piloted, which is very important so that we can learn and see actual examples, which can then feed back into the emerging framework. So that's I think the aim of this exercise. I will pause. I think I have seen a hand. I don't know, James, if you want to come in with a question.
Yeah, just briefly, Edith. To what extent do the different standards include registries, or like to include registries as part of their model?
It's a good question. I think from my perspective, when I call something as international standard, that has to have its own registry. That's kind of the category, because if you just come up with, that's a difference with the pilots, or if somebody develops just a a pilot it has to go through. So as far as I'm aware, these standards are all thinking about having their own sort of registry or way of issuing the credits. But happy to hear again, for example, from the global biodiversity standards or some of the other ones, and we might have some of the standards actually here on the call. So happy to also hear inputs. But I think for me, the standard has to have its own registry and ways to issue the credits, which while the developer pilots might not have, they just create some more bottom-up initiatives.
Yeah, just to confirm, Global Biodiversity Standard is still in its testing phase. We've tested it now on 77 sites across 6 biodiverse countries. And the methodology, working closely with the Society for Ecological Restoration, is in its second iteration now. But it will be registry based once it's rolled out.
Right, thanks, Paul. Great. In the interest of time, and again, love to hear more inputs, feedback, whether it's a useful exercise or how we should think about that. But this is something that we'll be continuing engaging with the support of the working group, the Biodiversity Consultancy and others. So very happy to have your inputs there. But in the interest of time, I actually will let Graham take over and tell us a bit more about the ecosystem metrics work that you are doing.
Hi everyone. So Graham Prescott from the Biodiversity Consultancy, and I'll talk a little bit about how ecosystem metrics might be used in crediting standards, all at pretty high level. Next slide, please. So as I'm sure you're all familiar with, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework is the most high-level consensus set of targets that developers could aim at. So it has consensus from 196 countries. It's not legally binding, but it sends a strong signal to the market, and regulations may follow. And it has several high-level ambitious goals, ambitions on ecosystems and species that could be relevant. Next slide, please. So Goal A broadly seeks to maintain the integrity, connectivity, resilience of all ecosystems, to restore it where it's degraded, and to enhance the area of land under protection, and fundamentally to reduce species extinction risk. So that gives a kind of wide range of targets, including avoiding loss of high ecological integrity areas, encouraging effective restoration, encouraging effective management of both protected and areas under other effective conservation mechanisms, and fundamentally reducing species extinction risk. So all of these could be potentially suitable for a combination of ecosystem condition metrics and or species extinction risk metrics such as STAR. So for example, if there was a credit based around restoration, we could use ecosystem condition metrics, which I'll talk a bit more about in future slides, to measure sort of uplift in ecosystem condition, and perhaps species extinction risk metrics such as STAR to prioritize where in the world a biodiversity credit project might make the biggest contribution to reducing species extinction risk. So we, TBC, are working with Vera on their nature crediting framework. So we can't go into details on that at the moment, but I can say that at a high level, the framework is explicitly aimed at meeting several of the GBF targets. And we expect that the framework, so not a methodology, but the high level framework will go out for public consultation next month. So please keep an eye out on that, and we would welcome any feedback. Next slide, please. What do we mean by ecosystem condition? So I think if there's a global crediting standard, you'll obviously have the key problem of all of the world's ecosystems are quite different from each other. So how do you compare a project maybe that's restoration based in intensively managed areas, and one that's aimed at protecting high integrity tropical rainforest, and compare that again with marine or freshwater projects? So ecosystem condition is a common currency or a common unit. So it's standardized between 0 and 1. And it's really, it's kind of a necessary abstraction to enable the comparison of different types of ecosystems. Next slide, please. And yeah, broadly, metrics that will go measures components of condition will include things like the extent, so how much of an ecosystem is there, what condition and significance are all important in looking at the state of biodiversity, but condition itself is comprised of the physical structure, so how it's physically organized, composition, what species are there and in what proportions, and function, so how well is the ecosystem actually performing the functions. So how it, and fundamentally, how is energy and matter transferred within it? So these all go into various condition metrics. And so these are abstractions that really help us to understand, you know, how close to its optimal state an ecosystem is. And they offer ways of standardizing and quantifying progress within a crediting framework. Next slide, please. When you're choosing metrics, obviously there are some high-level trade-offs. So it's impossible to have an extremely valid representation of local biodiversity that's granularly specific to the biodiversity there. That is also easy to apply everywhere across the world and very cheaply. So generally you have a trade-off between metrics that are feasible and scalable versus metrics that are valid and granular. And to be more valid and granular, you need on-the-ground field data collection or use useful proxies, and maybe combine with, whereas I think for scalable and feasible ones, you tend to rely more on using inferred and modeled relationships between state and pressure. So if we have a big picture knowledge of how much condition declines with land use, then we can use a land cover map to estimate what the condition might be. Next slide, please. And so a useful typology we find of kind of capturing the different kinds of ecosystem condition metrics and how they might be used in different places. So on one hand, you have sort of ecosystems, what we call ecosystem scale metrics. So these are often more sort of accounting frameworks. So this includes the Accounting for Nature, Econ family of metrics, or the UK biodiversity metrics. So these are sort of frameworks that can be tailored and customized to different ecosystems, but need, and you know, they might come with accompanying guidance on how they can be applied to a particular ecosystem. But they usually require some field data collection, and that's where you're granular and specific, and that's where you need to. These are most useful for actually measuring whether the condition has increased or decreased at a biodiversity crediting site, which will be fundamental to the assessment of whether credits are generated or not. And then going at higher levels, you have some that are a combination of maybe remote sensing and modeled pressure state relationships for specific biomes like the Forest Landscape Integrity Index or Coral Reef Watch Index. So they can be used to prioritize sites within a biome type. And then you have realm specific ones like mean species abundance or ecoregion intactness index that are really extrapolations from modeled pressure state relationships. So they won't allow anyone to determine how many credits have been generated at specific sites because they're not accurate enough. But they could be used to prioritize either parts of the world that are degraded and in need of restoration, or parts of the world that are still relatively intact and in urgent need of threat abatement and conservation. And then my final slide coming up. So just to summarize, so biodiversity credits can and perhaps should be linked to goal 8 targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework. There's a wide range, so measuring condition will be an essential component, likely of most metrics and most crediting proposals. And to do that, we'll need to use ecosystem condition metrics as some way of abstracting and comparing across sites. And there are more high-level ones that might be used to prioritize parts of the world in need of investment, and specific ones that can be adapted to actually measuring gains or losses of ecosystem condition on the ground for the generation of credits. Thank you very much. And yeah, happy for any questions either now or later as appropriate.
Thanks a lot, Graham. I don't think there are any questions yet. So just looking at the chat, please.
I had a quick question, Edith.
All right. I see hands. Perfect.
Thank you very much, Graham, for that. Very, very interesting. Two quick questions then, really. One is what geographical scale does the index, does it go down to or could go down to? And secondly, I'm just intrigued by the similarities and differences with the seed biocomplexity index that ETH Zurich have done. So just wonder if you had any observations on that without going into great detail, but those are my two sort of thoughts hearing your interesting presentation. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Jeremy. So briefly, scale. So obviously it depends on the crediting framework, but this could be applied at sort of global scale. This is a way to compare sites across the world, but the more, if a framework seeks to cover all possible realms, then it will have to have some modularity within it. So it will have to be able to say, okay, this is a framework that could be applied anywhere in the world, but here's your coral reef module, or here's your Andean peatland module. Yeah, see, it's an interesting one because so I've not mapped where this fits onto that. So that's a job to do in the future afterwards. I think it's interesting because it does have that. So it's somewhere, obviously it is based on a huge amount of data. So it's very data rich. That makes it quite granular and specific, but it is kind of applicable across the world. So I think it probably needs, so I'd be interested to see some sort of field testing of it to see where it kind of fits on that spectrum. But, something I didn't get into and would be happy to discuss about later is the extent to which technological advances such as remote sensing and machine learning, which obviously have gone into seed in a very effective way, can help to bridge the gap between feasible, scalable, and between the sort of granular, specific, and the feasible, scalable. But yeah, happy to touch base on that later.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I know we're very short of time, but very, very quickly come back on the first point. On the scale, I was thinking, because seed claimed to go down to a very small geographical scale, you were sort of saying how big could you go? I meant how small could you go, actually, at project level, level.
Yes. So, sorry. So the accounting, some sort of accounting framework can go to a very, at the ecosystem scale level, what you would say, what a accounting framework would say is, okay, for instance, in this particular type of project, you have to measure stem density, species composition of trees and canopy cover. And, those are the fundamental things. So it would be a sort of basically an instruction manual for the types of measurements that you have to go, and then how those are standardized in a particular way. So that is for a quite specific project. I'm not sure exactly how small, what the minimum size of project that will be creditable would probably depend on that. But in theory, there's no reason why it couldn't apply to a 1 hectare site.
Perfect. And I think we can keep the technology discussion at the end if you have time. I think it would be very interesting to hear about which of the emerging new technologies have best chances or relevance for these new methodologies. I see, James, your hands up as well, if you want to.
Yeah, sure. Just quickly on the species point, why have you chosen to focus on extinction risk rather than abundance?
So
diversity.
Abundance, go on.
Or diversity for that matter as well.
Yes. So I think I picked up, these are sort of illustrative examples where I think so basically abundance and diversity are also very valid targets and ecologically important. And I picked a few that was not meant to be the exclusive list. It was just indicative of what could go into it. I think at the moment, I would say in a global crediting framework, there are some global data sets on species extinction risk, which are things like STAR and persistence score, which is in development, which actually are combinations of where species are threatened, where you have a lot of range restricted species, and where you have a lot of species diversity. So diversity does come into that, and there are global layers. Whereas species abundance, while incredibly important for ecosystem functioning, there aren't very good global data layers on multi-species, species abundance. So you have things like the Living Planet Index, but those are quite geographically biased. So I think species extinction risk is easier. but I could also imagine things like species richness, species abundance going into the composition element of an ecosystem condition metric. But yeah, I think richness and abundance, or diversity measures related to richness and abundance are very valid things to prioritize. They're just a bit harder to do in a globally consistent way, perhaps.
Perfect. Thanks for that. So again, I encourage some other questions to keep your questions and sending, and we'll also have time at the end to discuss more. So Frank, I think it's your turn.
Thank you very much, Edith. While I have the floor, I thought I'd give you a very quick comment on the previous discussion about species metrics. I think it's really important to recognize that there is a strong marker in the global biodiversity framework for reducing species extinction. So you need to find a way to address that question specifically. And if you focus on things like species richness, the possibility is that you are taking things in the wrong direction. If you're working, for instance, in a very important but species poor ecosystem, the best way to improve species richness is to introduce lots of weeds. So I think you need to be very careful about setting a target and generating a credit based just on species richness. Anyway, a little diversion there. I wanted to give a quick perspective on where it is that nature positive fits into the notion of biodiversity credits, particularly as nature positive as a larger framing seems to be gaining a lot of momentum, particularly for companies. And I guess we are looking at a kind of set of conflicting motivations. First of all, there's the notion that TNFD is emerging that could possibly be linked in the future to regulatory frameworks. So companies might be encouraged or even coerced into contributing to, for instance, the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and therefore want to get ahead of that game, make sure that they understand what's involved in making these contributions and ensuring that they are things which are validatable, verifiable, but also they're worried about doing them in a way that could be regarded as being linked to greenwashing. So there's a strong push for people to understand what nature positive is and where it is that credits fit into that framing. So I think the first thing we would want to be clear about here is that we're not talking about an individual organization like a company being nature positive in a sort of accounting sense. What we're talking about is that companies and civil society and governments, whatever, can make contributions to nature positive overall. And the nature positive we're talking about is that framed in the global biodiversity framework. It's the notion that you're bending the curve away from biodiversity loss towards being biodiversity positive. And the contributions that you make to that are the important things that need to happen. There's a larger framing of this, the global goal for nature, which has a range of different principles set out about what it is that nature positive consists of. And in general, it breaks out nature into the major components, the non-living bits of it: soil, water, air, and then living nature, biodiversity. I think the important component of this is how it is you can generate nature positive impacts as a company, for instance, using biodiversity credits. And if we're looking at that in the context of what you might think of the living nature component of biodiversity, of nature positive, the biodiversity positive side of things, there is this clear statement in the global biodiversity framework around species and ecosystems. So the focus for biodiversity for biodiversity credits is really useful and important, because it enables the people who want to contribute to identify where it is, if they don't have a direct impact on biodiversity on the ground, they can actually enter a secondary market for biodiversity credits and deliver their obligations under whatever regulatory framework might come in the future. So in order to do that, you have to have the appropriate set of metrics available. You just heard from Graham how an ecosystem metric might work. It's going to be a very complicated and technologically challenging and expensive process to develop if you need to set up a series of protocols for lots and lots of different ecosystem types. But that may be one of the few ways in which you can make that work. You then need to do the same thing for species, and as I mentioned just now, focusing on species that are likely to go extinct is a good way of targeting the urgent aspects of the loss of biodiversity. That's clearly not dealing with the whole of conservation issues. You need to prevent the loss of widespread and what are currently common species, for instance, in extensive areas of habitat. But the really important thing at this point for many people, in the public perception at least, is that focusing on the species that are about to go extinct is a good thing to do, and it's particularly good for a company. So the important framing as far as the relationship between biodiversity credits and nature positive is concerned is that biodiversity credits, as in the current framing at least, are things that are supplementary. They are additional to what a company should be doing through the mitigation hierarchy. So in the mitigation hierarchy, I'm sure you're aware, you're looking to generate net positive impact. So if you have a mine that has caused the loss of biodiversity through its construction, then you need to remediate that loss. And you can do that through a range of different steps, starting with avoiding the impacts as far as you can, going on to minimizing the impacts that you do have, to doing some kind of compensation, and then ultimately doing an offset, which of course is the last and most expensive step in the mitigation hierarchy. All those things are part of a company's obligation to deliver net positive impact under the mitigation hierarchy. They are not creditable. So if you are looking to generate biodiversity credits, they need to be things which are outside your immediate sphere of influence. They are things that you are buying in order to contribute to the global societal goal of the global biodiversity framework, beyond what it is that you need to do under the mitigation hierarchy. However, both of those things could count as nature positive, biodiversity positive contributions. What you are doing in your mitigation hierarchy is you are reducing the extent, magnitude, and impact of bad things to biodiversity. So that's a thing that you need to achieve if you're going to deliver the GBF. But in addition, you can deliver nature positive contributions, biodiversity positive contributions by doing more than that. And that's perhaps where biodiversity credits can give you the opportunity to make those things happen. I think the bigger picture story here is that this is a very complicated, confusing, and potentially overlapping set of ideas and principles that are going to evolve very quickly with time, as biodiversity credits have. But placing what you do as a company or as a developer in this larger nature positive, biodiversity credits mitigation hierarchy framework is really important to be able to ensure that you're understanding how you can make these positive contributions. At IUCN, we're in the process of developing a working paper on how this fits together from the perspective of biodiversity positive, with pathways that companies can take to move down delivery of biodiversity positive contributions. And within that, there will need to be a clear framing of how it is that the biodiversity credits process can work. And in particular, for instance, if the biodiversity credits market were to include a secondary market, how you would tie those into contributions to the global biodiversity framework. I think it's really important to underline that if any of this is to perform in terms of creating genuine additional impact, you have to be able to see what the total goal is, a numerical goal for the Global Biodiversity Framework, and what contribution you've made to it, either from your biodiversity positive contribution from the mitigation hierarchy or from a biodiversity credit. And in this sense, we can pretty much do that for species extinction risk. We can identify how many units of species extinction risk are needed to bend the curve of biodiversity loss under that species extinction target in the GBF. And you can apportion that target across countries, across sectors, across commodities, across value chains, across projects, across civil society organizations, and across policies that can then be formulated and delivered by governments. That's a really tricky thing to do in other circumstances. So I think it's really important that we focus on things that are achievable, and that we understand how it is that a biodiversity credits market, either a voluntary market or a secondary market, can add to that. And that's a thing which is going to be a big question in the near future. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Frank. That's very interesting to hear how this whole market is shaping up, and the relation to nature positive frameworks and biodiversity positive. And I was just wondering if you could maybe a little bit talk about, so you mentioned the species extinction risks and the STAR metric. So that's the STAR metric that you describe how it relates to the global goals. Maybe if you have just some updates, I don't know, for the audience, if everybody is familiar. It has been launched a while ago, but maybe just to explain, I think it's available with the IBAT tool. But if you wanted to maybe give a quick update, where is STAR, and also maybe the latest development on the marine and some of the layers. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Edith. That's very useful. So STAR is a mechanism that allows you to evaluate the opportunity for reducing species extinction risk in any given polygon around the world. So you could use it at a project level, or at an administrative level, a jurisdictional level, or even at a global level. The important point being you can add up the contributions that can be made across those different scales, so that you can say that across your company portfolio of investments, the places where you can go to generate contributions to the Global Biodiversity Framework will vary, and these are the places where you can deal with them, and these are the likely costs involved in delivering those outcomes according to local circumstances. So currently STAR has data on extinction risk of terrestrial vertebrates, essentially. There are, as you can imagine, the range of opportunity for delivering extinction risk for terrestrial vertebrates is quite concentrated in places like the Himalayas, the Andes, off islands and island continents like Madagascar, the Caribbean, places where there are lots of threatened species that occur in small ranges. That tends to be the places where you can deliver these outcomes most efficiently. You can break those out across sectors and the threats that are delivered by sectors, such as invasive species and habitat change, but also things like hunting, pressures that aren't dealt with very well by other mechanisms that are available for assessing, for instance, ecosystem level threats. There is under development a marine STAR layer, which has been submitted for publication. I hope that'll be out within the next few months. And there is also a freshwater STAR layer, also in the process of being developed and published. Just for information, I mentioned the fact of there being a number attached to the global goal. So the global goal is that we have an 80% reduction in species extinction risk, I think, by 2050. That essentially equates to about 2 million STAR units around the world, possibly a few more than that. And you could break out those 2 million STAR units at the moment, by 5 by 5 kilometer pixel across the Earth. So you know what you can deliver in any one point based on how you mitigate the threats that apply to species in those polygons and how much that will contribute to the global goal in numerical terms. That's the really exciting opportunity you have here.
Great, thanks for that. And there's one more quick question, and then after that we'll have to move on. So a question around the mitigation hierarchy that you mentioned. Does that mean that biodiversity credits can only be earned until the company has reduced their impact? So how does that work?
The current formulation for biodiversity credits, and I really hope this will stick, is that the biodiversity credit is only valid as a credit that you can either retire or sell on if it's something that is going beyond the impact that's being generated by a company that should be dealt with through the mitigation hierarchy. Otherwise, you're talking about an offset, and there's a market for offsets, but it's a different character, if you like, of impact. Compared to a biodiversity credit mechanism. A credit is already a completely positive thing to deliver, whereas an offset is a compensation for something bad that's happened. And those two are not the same things. You can buy a biodiversity credit from wherever you want, and then say, this is something that's a positive asset that I've generated. A biodiversity offset is explicitly designed to compensate for the impacts that you have already or look like you are going to have on identifiable pieces of biodiversity. Thanks, Graham. He's just put a distinction in the chat illustrating that. Sorry, I'm running out of voice here.
Great. No, thanks for that. And maybe we can, I think this is a very interesting, has a temporal element to it. How do we verify? And that's what's happening in the carbon markets, of course. How do we know that the companies are net zero? Should we wait until we figure it out, or should we start, given the urgency? How do we make sure the money starts flowing while the companies get their mitigation hierarchy sorted? So I think that's maybe we can touch base on the back, but something to be seen how it gets solved in this context, but fully agree that's all we need to be careful, the distinction between offsets and credits. And I think that's has been highlighted by many of the different task force. So coming into Jeremy on the nature finance and their task force and their work to give us an update where things are, and especially given this recent meeting in Paris.
Thanks very much, Edith, and nice to see you again, Frank, and others. Yes, let's have a little tour d'horizon, if I can put it like that. And I am very much the stand-in today. I do understand these issues, but our technical expert on it, Dorothy, is unfortunately ill in bed. So I'm happy to be here and hope that this won't be a particularly technical presentation. Let me just say that. But if you could go on to the next slide, please, Edith. Yeah, I mean, much of this you already know, we've already heard. Clearly, the Kunming Montreal GBF created a sense of focus, urgency, legitimacy around the whole issue of nature markets, but I think in particular biodiversity credits. We know that Target 19, there was a reference to innovative financial instruments, and the reference to biodiversity credits was in there. And that, you know, as someone who's been heavily involved in the CBD for a long time, that was a first, a positive development, something to be noted. And beyond that, we've seen a lot of work coming out of two recent summits in particular at the political level and driving some of the policy. First of all, the One Forest Summit, which took place co-hosted by France and Gabon in Libreville at the beginning of March, where the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, organized a high-level working group and which produced a report on innovative finance for nature and people, which set out some of the challenges and parameters that needed to be looked at, a series of recommendations in there. And then most recently, and it's already been referred to, the Summit for a New Global Financing Pact just a couple of weeks ago in Paris, more than 50 world leaders, a very, very high level attendance, looking at macroeconomic, structural, global finance issues, but interestingly, I think quite a noticeable weaving into many of those discussions of both climate and, to an extent, nature, which I think is something that certainly hasn't been the case in the past and is increasingly interesting for the agenda we're all concerned about. Now, as part of that, Nature Finance was asked by both the UK and the French governments to work on a paper which we produced, which is called Harnessing Biodiversity Credits for People and Planet, quite a substantial paper, but one which we worked with a very, very large number of our partners, knowledge partners, contacts, stakeholders. And so many of you have probably already been consulted by Dorothy and her colleagues, Dorothy Hare and her colleagues, in developing that paper. So the paper was launched at the summit, along with what's called a global roadmap for harnessing biodiversity credits. And this starts from the presumption that these are a market that is taking off, and the distinction between offsets and credits is certainly made in there, but it's very much from the presumption that these markets are really starting to take off anyway, and therefore there needs to be serious attention to how they are designed. I'll come back to that. Nature Positive, Frank's unpacked that very helpfully, and the issue of whether there are real gains to be had beyond the mitigation hierarchy, or is it simply a matter of offsetting? Again, Frank, you've helpfully touched on, and that distinction is important to make. But I think the emphasis in the biocredit space that we see is particularly towards nature gains and nature certificates, and away from just talking about offsets. And clearly credits are not the solution to the financing gap that exists and that was recognized in the GBF, but they are one among a number of instruments, and one that seems to have real promise if we can get the equation right. On the next slide, please. So this is the paper. Oh, it's got slightly garbled the picture, but anyway, this is the paper we produced with many others' help, for including Carbon 4 or Carbon 4 from France, for the summit a couple of weeks ago in Paris, and we have suggested a taxonomy here that really helps unpack the issue in the way you see, in terms of what are biodiversity credit markets about. And there are a whole range, and offsets are just one of those in there. And you see there are philanthropic claims, bragging rights, if you like, about protecting and restoring nature. There are offsets that are regulated in one jurisdiction or another. There are insetting credits at various points in the economic value chain, for instance, in the food commodity value chain. There are biodiversity linked or enhanced carbon credits. And then there are also secondary markets, if you like, where biodiversity credits may become a new asset class in their own right and traded independently of the nature asset that underlies them. If we could go to the next slide. This is just, if you like, our take on where some of these things are going. You have, Edith, given us a very helpful sort of overview of where you see some of the market developments going, but I think, I'm sorry that this slide's become—
Yeah, I'm sorry for it's a bit,
slightly skew width, but I hope you can see enough of it, and when you send them around, Edith, we'll hopefully be able to fix that. So, questions we've touched on already are, should there be offsets or no offsets? Secondary or no secondary markets? One unit or several units for measuring what a biodiversity credit is or should be? Are these about global markets or about local or national markets? And is it about voluntary or mandatory biodiversity credits? These are all issues that are being hotly debated, and where the different taxonomies, the different categories I mentioned in the previous slide, all have different points of intersection with the discussion. And I think the one that's highlighted, you can't see it that easily, but the fifth one down, beyond value chain biodiversity credits, I think is the one where the debate is most active at the moment. So that's why that's highlighted. Actually, it's less highlighted than in the other graphics, but that's the one I wanted to draw your attention to. Voluntary biodiversity contributions, gains and uplifts. I think where developing biodiversity credit markets is having a lot of attention. The next slide. When we think about the development of these markets, and much of this thinking is applicable across not only biodiversity credit markets, but other types of nature markets. And Nature Finance has been acting as the convener and secretariat of the Task Force on Nature Markets for the last nearly 18 months. And the task force will be producing its final report and recommendations in about a month's time. It's due to be launched at the Pan Amazon Summit in August in Brazil. But thinking about these markets, we see it as very important that there are some real key governance principles established around purpose, around integrity, around product specifications, some of which you've already touched on today, on transparency and accountability, who has a voice in this, who has agency in the development of these markets. Not touched on much yet, but what is the right price, how a price is set so that they're fair both for the supplier, both for the project developer, and also for the purchaser, for those in other markets that are trying to, and where are the rewards distributed? What are the right policy incentives to create these kind of the right price signals and the right incentives? And where does regulatory oversight come in? So what that slide's really saying is there is a lot more to this than just getting the design of the standard right, important though that is. There are many other aspects to create a well-governed, high integrity biodiversity credits market in our view. So on the next slide, you'll see what we think and what the roadmap that I touched on earlier also has picked up as being important. And three things seem to us most important in this. Timely scale, so that there's a scaling of high quality credits and that these are done in a way that is high integrity, both on the supply and the demand side, that the price is fair, both for sovereigns that own the jurisdictions in which they're being created, but also for indigenous peoples, local communities, that there is a real fair, equitable distribution of the rewards and that it's not skewed towards a few actors in the market, and that they have a credible impact, clearly a credible impact on the nature goals that we're seeking to achieve, but also a credible impact on the social and societal goals for the people who live in the areas where the biodiversity exists and are its stewards. On the next slide, yeah, I mean, we can skip over that. This is almost like a kind of snapshot of some of your members or some of your partners in CPIC. But, you know, you see there, as we know, there are a very large number of diverse organizations working in this space, and you've touched on many of them already. So here's just a slightly more icon version of some of the things you've already explained and spelled out today. But, you know, it's a very fast growing scene. And there are, as you see at the bottom of this slide, a number of sovereigns where there are, you know, interesting and significant national programs of biodiversity offset, mandatory offsets occurring, but also real interests, such as in Australia, in developing credit markets in a wider sense. So this is just a snapshot, which many of you are familiar with. In the next slide, I'll just finish with 2 slides about the roadmap itself. So I think what's important to emphasize is that it is country driven. So it has political ownership. The UK and France were the co-instigators of it. They've initiated this at the Paris summit a couple of weeks ago, but they see this as something which will draw in many other countries. Very much the hope that there will be a number of countries from the south that feel co-ownership of this, but also draw in many, many other stakeholders for a process of, if you like, co-creation of what good looks like. And that's the intention of the high-level advisory panel that's been established as part of this roadmap, to be co-chaired by 2 very leading business figures, actually, from one from the UK and one from France, but with a panel that we hope, we don't know because we're not designing it, but we hope as Nature Finance will be diverse, inclusive, and have true global coverage in terms of the type of actors and the geographies and perspectives. Clearly, this high-level advisory panel is going to need to work very much with existing initiatives, including your own, BCA, WEF, many others, and build on the gaps and the synergies that can be identified, maybe through a series of topic-specific working groups. It has in its short text, there's only 3 or 4 pages about the existing at the moment about the global roadmap, some landing zones, a landing zone of ambition at COP28, and a further landing zone with other points for delivery by COP16. But all of this to be unpacked and developed once I think the high-level advisory panel gets going. And in the final slide, you'll see, I hope, 5 design challenges that are included in that roadmap. You touched on them very, very briefly, Edith, in your introductory slide. I quite like the way you got them each down to 1 word, so well done on that. I mean, MRV, yes, credible, timely, affordable measurement and monitoring. So very important. 2 important sides of the equation, scaling both demand and supply, both with high integrity, so that there is real understanding that this is not greenwashing. This is real. Critically, I think you called it benefit sharing. Yes, benefit sharing, positive impact on nature and people. So that's about ensuring that the rewards do go back to the people who produce it, who are maintaining, enhancing, restoring the biodiversity, and the indigenous peoples and local communities feel a real stake in this, and not that it's somehow being done in a way that financializes nature and takes control and agency away from them. And finally, on governance, those broader aspects that I've already touched on. So it's not just about the nature of the credits themselves, but issues such as we did touch on registries, but also transparency in those, the policy framework, and so on. So it's a level of governance issues that are important, and which this global roadmap and the high-level advisory panel is intending to try and get its teeth around. I'll stop there. I mean, I hope that gives a slightly additional perspective to what's been a very interesting discussion so far today. Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Jaron. That's super helpful to hear that. I have one quick follow-up question, maybe just again, coming from seeing what's happening in the voluntary carbon markets and seeing all this evolving space and actors, I was just wondering, is this new roadmap and this advisory panel, should we think about it as the new ICVCM for biodiversity credits, or what do you see? Do we need one? Will we have one? Or how do you see this government-led kind of initiatives, and how does it, or it's more inserting into the UN CBD processes? Where does it stand? Maybe if you can just elaborate on that.
Well, I don't know is the answer. It could be any of the above or all of the above. It's certainly got a political ownership because it's country driven, and the expectation is that it will be not just 2 northern countries. I mean, at the launch event, which we helped facilitate as Nature Finance, we had the president of Gabon, we had the state secretary from Brazil, Colombia was there, as well as private sector actors, UK and France. So, I mean, I think it will have a strong political steer. I think it's a coalition. The intention, I think, is it's a coalition of countries owning a political process and expecting some useful, high-level technical and policy advice. So if that's comparable to the what's happening in the carbon market space, then yes. But I think it will have a strong sense of obligation to deliver things directly into the 2 major convention COPs.
Yeah, perfect. Great. Well, thanks a lot. We'll watch with interest the next steps and see how the advisory panel evolves, and look forward to engaging as CPIC with that process. I think we are a bit behind, but we still have plenty of times for the next section where while we are, and I'm just skip over, while we are waiting for these national processes and emergence of all those different standards, give you an introduction into the biodiversity impact credits, which is getting operationalized, and if I'm not mistaken, is already ready to be used. So very keen to hear more from Stuart and Paul on this particular type of credits, and I think with the question in our minds and the audience is how can we get involved, but how can the developers, plenty of people are here, involved with this new standard. So over to you, look forward to hearing more about that.
Edith, thank you very much indeed for inviting us along today. Just to introduce myself, my name is Stuart Clenaghan. I'm a trustee of Botanic Gardens Conservation International, and I'm also the co-founder of Green Gold Forestry in Peru, which is Peru's largest private sector conservation project. Next slide, please, Edith. So we're introducing today biodiversity impact credits. I'll emphasize in the first sentence that these are not offsets, but credits that have a positive contribution to reducing extinction risks. And what biodiversity impact credits enable organizations to do is to measure their impact on global extinction risks, mitigate that impact in a scientifically robust way, and engage with world-class conservation partners. And I think what's surprising to many is that we already have a $100 million investment-ready pipeline to conserve critically endangered and endangered species of trees. Our work has been put together by Botanic Gardens Conservation International. I'll wait for Paul's going to speak in the second half of this presentation, and he'll introduce you to what BGCI does and the breadth of our relationships around the world. We've also been working with one of the world's leading theoretical ecologists, Axel Rosberg from Queen Mary University here in London. Axel unfortunately can't join us today, so I'm now going to try and explain to you the theory behind what we're doing. So if we go on to the next page. This is a slide that you and readers of newspapers and news sites around the world will be familiar with, that we're now entering into the 6th mass extinction. And of course, the rate of extinction of all sorts of species of animals and plants is accelerating. And the reason for that is that we've changed the environment so fast that adaptation and evolution is unable to enable huge numbers of species to adapt to those new environments, and they're dying out. So if you go on to the next slide, please. Of course, this is recognized, as has been already mentioned, and Frank, thank you very much. I think you set us up very nicely for our presentation. In the Global Biodiversity Framework, and target 4 of that is to halt extinction of known threatened species. And of this, we understand that around about 1 million, at least 1 million species around the world are at threat of extinction. And unless we take action, they will go extinct. Target 15, incidentally, is that transnational companies, financial institutions are encouraged now to disclose their biodiversity impact and take actions to reduce negative impacts. So next slide. Again, something that you'll be familiar with, the Living Planet Index, which is owned by WWF, is probably not perfect, but it's computed from changes in population sizes of species. And of course, if the population decreases, that increases the risk that that species will go extinct. So if we can reverse this worrying drop in the Living Planet Index, we can reduce the extinction risk to species. Next slide, please. So our biodiversity impact credits are quite simply defined. And they're defined as the change in population caused by an action against that species' global population. So for example, if a mining company were to reduce the number of trees of a certain species, let's say from 100,000 down to 10,000 as a result of its population, then that number would be minus 90,000 over the 100,000 of original species. So that would be a negative biodiversity impact credit. On the other hand, if you increased the species, number of examples of a species near at risk, then you can actually earn a positive biodiversity impact. So if you take a species of tree, let's say it's down to its last 10, and you increase that to 110, then your biodiversity impacts that you earn will be 100 over 110, and that will be a positive number. And of course, you'll be doing something about a critically endangered species. Next slide. So what's interesting, this is Axel's work, is that biodiversity impact credits approximate to many other of the metrics that have been used or are used by ecologists and others and conservation experts for a long period of time. So range size rarity, for example, which has been used now for more than 30 years, is approximately equivalent or convertible into bits. If you press the next button, edit. It's the same with the star metric and the ecosystem damage metric, which is the biodiversity footprint for financial institutions. And the point of the two maps at the bottom is that we've compared here range size rarity with star, and you can see that the maps pretty much overlap in terms of things. So in other words, you can take measures of biodiversity, which are quite commonly used by consultants and by academics and researchers, and they roughly equate to biodiversity impact credits. So if you next slide, please. So there's quite a lot of useful tools around to do this. And of course, there are a lot of consultants that can do this work for you as well. So you can take a portfolio. So this portfolio could be an investment portfolio, or it might be a portfolio of projects in a major company. It could actually be a portfolio of any institution. It could be my household, it could be a university, it could be a corporation, it might even be a country. And you can look at the supply chains that come in and go out of that organization, and you can assess those for their impact on many different environmental criteria. But we're particularly interested here in damage to ecosystems. Press the button, edit. So you can look at damage to ecosystems, and you can come up with a measure of your, what would be expected in most cases to be a negative biodiversity impact for a particular organization. So if you go on to the next slide, this has been done. So Oxford University did this 2 or 3 years ago. There's a very interesting paper that was published in Science, I understand. And Oxford's biodiversity impact credit is minus 1.6 species. That's not minus 1.6 species a year. That's a total impact of 1.6 species on all of the supply chains that come in and go out of Oxford University. So that supplies of paper and food and energy and travel and so forth as well. ASN Bank did this for their $3.4 billion impact investor fund, and they found that that fund, an impact fund, actually had a negative species impact of about 8.1 species. And the BBC is doing this as well. We don't know what the results are, but they're going to have a biodiversity impact as well. And so the question is, if you know that you have your contribution to the world extinction crisis is a certain number of species, what can you do about it? And what's the most impactful thing that you can do to mitigate your negative impact on species? So this is really, if you go on to the next slide, please edit. This is really where we come in. In fact, you can have the most impact by focusing on the species that are most at risk, those whose populations have shrunk to a point that they're nearly extinct. Because if you can put those species back into the wild in sufficient quantities so that they become self-sustaining, you can create a positive biodiversity impact credit. That credit is going to be always near to a value of 1 if you're successful. It won't be over 1 unless you focus on more than one species. And we believe that trees are incredibly important to focus on. Why? First of all, many other species are dependent on trees for their livelihoods. Paul will tell you about the English oak, but there's 2,300 species that are dependent on the English oak, at least for part of their life cycle. So if you stop a tree from going extinct, you can probably have a multiple impact on other species. The second thing, of course, is that trees are big contributors to landscapes. So if you want to help restore a landscape, don't fill it up with weeds, as somebody else said earlier. Fill it up with things that have a role in that landscape and can help other things live there as well. Many of the species that are at risk are in developing countries. So by restoring those species in developing countries, you can create positive impacts on local communities, and you can create jobs and other businesses around that that actually sustainably help those communities to thrive. And last, of course, though we're not emphasizing this, trees, generally speaking, although there are some spindly ones, have a net positive impact on carbon. So they're really worth focusing on. So with that, I'm going to turn my speaker off, and I'm going to turn over to Paul Smith now, who's General Secretary of BGCI, and he will tell you much more about what BGCI is actually doing and that $100 million portfolio that we have ready to fund right now.
Thanks, Stuart. And if I could have the next slide, please, that would be great. Okay, so as Stuart has said, BGCI, with the world's largest plant conservation network, with something like 850 member institutions now across the globe. But many of those are the big guys, your Kews and your New Yorks and your Sydneys and so on, but the vast majority are smaller botanical and forestry organizations in developing countries and in biodiversity hotspots. And those are the ones that we try to focus on. And with that network comes this global network of expertise. Also, we estimate around 60,000 experts in basically how to grow plants, science, and so on. Educators amongst them as well. Next slide, please. We also coordinate the Ecological Restoration Alliance, and these are some of the members of that alliance. And these are organizations which have for decades been involved in biodiverse restoration work. So they bring a lot of expertise in how to grow a wide range of species. Just for the record, botanic gardens in our community, and we keep the database on this, grow about a third of all known plant diversity and around 18,000 different species of trees. So there's a lot of knowledge in there how to grow a diverse range of species. Next slide. We also lead the Global Tree Assessment. This is the largest red listing assessment I've ever undertaken with the Global Tree Specialist Group under IUCN Species Survival Commission. And we published this report in September 2021 as an interim report, but based on about 92% of trees having some kind of a conservation assessment. Next slide, please. And these are the headlines from that report. There are roughly 58,500 known tree species in the world. Interestingly, there are more rare tree species than common tree species, with 58% endemic to a single country. And the big news is about a third are threatened with extinction. So it's ironic that with everyone wanting to plant trees, we have about a third of all known tree species currently threatened with extinction. Next slide. And when you look at those that are critically endangered, and that number has now climbed, over 2,000 of those and over 440 with fewer than 50 individuals left in the wild. These are literally about to fall off the planet. The Hyophobia maricolis there is on the left in Mauritius is known as the loneliest tree in the world. So a point I'd like to make here, and a point that Frank made earlier, is that these really threatened species tend to fall between the cracks if we just concentrate on ecosystem services. It's really important that we tackle extinction risk as well. Next slide. We also have a lot of experience in this over the last 15 years, and there's another report you can download from our website here. We've been involved in the recovery of about 400 threatened tree species under the Global Trees Campaign, working with Fauna and Flora International and partners all over the world. So we have a whole cohort of people trained in and we've practiced in species recovery, tree species recovery. Next slide. And really the point that Stuart made is that trees are keystone species. Unfortunately, what we're seeing, particularly for carbon, is large areas of exotics being planted. You'll see eucalyptus and pinus and so on everywhere because they're fast growing. And there are very comparatively few benefits for biodiversity associated with that. You plant a native species and the knock-on for insects, lichens, fungi, mammals, birds is massive compared to an exotic. And that keystone species element is really important here for bangs for your buck around biodiversity. Next slide. So how would this work? Here's one that we did earlier. This is Malawi's national tree, Witheringtonia whitey, the Mulanje cedar. When we started this project, there were only 7 mature individuals remaining in its natural range. This is on Mulanje Mountain, which is a 30 square kilometer massif in South Malawi. Working with local partners, next slide, please. Local communities around the mountain who initially believed that only God could plant this tree. They've now, with expert support, have raised hundreds of thousands of seedlings in these 10 community nurseries and planted those back onto the mountain. I'm not saying all 500,000 of those have survived, but we will have made a massive impact on that species and mitigating extinction risk, but also created jobs and created income that is sustained as restoration efforts continue. It's a very high value timber as well, so it's also being sold elsewhere throughout Malawi just as a utility species. So there are win-wins available, I think, as well. Bear in mind that many of these highly threatened tree species are threatened due to overexploitation, so they are inherently useful to people. Next slide. And we have a pipeline of these. If you go to this treeconservationfund.org website, you can play around there and have a look from all over the world. We've got these critically endangered tree species that are falling between the cracks. We have people who can restore them, who can recover them, but we don't have the finance to do it. So this is where we think there's a huge conservation need, but also an opportunity for packaging up these as biodiversity credits. Next slide. And that's where I will leave it, with a beautiful picture from outside my house of Quercus robur, of the English oak, which, as Stuart said, is also host to a whole legion of other biodiversity. Thank you.
Fascinating. Thanks a lot. Right on time. We have 2 minutes left, so I don't think, unfortunately, we'll have time for a panel Q&A, but we had a great conversation. I just have one question I think came through the chat. Maybe elaborate on that.
Horses.
Yeah,
horses.
We do get a bit of a background noise, but okay, so if you could maybe elaborate on how does this credit relate to what we just discussed about the mitigation hierarchy? How do we know that those organizations that have the footprint can't just plant somewhere else and not do anything about the extinction? Or do you get around that because it's a different methodology? Maybe if you, Stuart, could elaborate on that.
Yeah, well, actually, I'll just make one point before giving the answer, which is that we estimate that the cost of putting a tree back into a viable position is around about $500,000 or so, not that expensive. So the project that Paul illustrated in Malawi was completed for less than that amount. Of course, prices are going up at the moment, but that's to put a number on how cost effective it is to conserve a species. So I think the question relates to, is this an offset, right? Well, what we know is that most organizations, whether it's my household or whether it's Oxford University or the BBC or General Electric, actually have very little direct impact on the environment. Of course, what they do is they buy a lot of stuff from people who do have an impact on the environment. So actually complex organizations, even if they wanted to stop doing the thing that's causing an extinction risk, have little control over it or little direct influence. So, but you can measure your biodiversity impact through biodiversity impact credits, as I've illustrated earlier, and you can mitigate that impact by looking to save a tree that somewhere in the world is under critical risk. And Paul's going to jump in now and explain this with a bit more detail.
Well, I was just going to say that I anticipated that question coming up because of what's in the chat and you know what Graham had said and Frank. I think we're with everybody on this. That you know what came up in the chat was that we don't have ways currently of measuring that hierarchy, that mitigation hierarchy for most companies. What we do have and what we've got here is some methodologies where you can measure your biodiversity footprint, if you like. And let's say your biodiversity footprint is 2, then arguably you would be wanting to buy credits for 3 species so that it's a positive, it's above your footprint. But I think that's the fundamental problem is how you measure these things. And I think one of the beauties of this methodology is that it is relatively simple to measure. How many trees were there when you started? How many trees were there when you finished? And you know, we can easily get bogged down in complexity with biodiversity. Why not start simple? Based on good ecological principles, that trees are keystone species and support lots of other biodiversity. We need to get going with this. And I'm just worried about spending another 15 years talking about what biodiversity is and the metrics related to that.
Fair enough. Simple is good. I think that's a very good message, and I think it would be great to have more time to dive into, but unfortunately we'll have to wrap up. Maybe just one word from you. How can people engage? Is it going under public consultation, or is it ready to be used, this methodology? If you could finish with that, maybe.
Yeah, people can contact us through the Tree Conservation Fund website or directly through our website, and there's emails there. We have signed NDAs with a couple of organizations now, with some others coming online, but they are non-exclusive NDAs. And the idea is that we try this. Whether they're called biodiversity credits, given you know how immature the market is for those, is another question. But you know, our main aim is to get threatened tree species into recovery and nature-based solutions programs.
Perfect. Yeah, excellent. All right. I see some questions are still trickling through, and just to say there are very good questions also around carbon. Are we reinventing the wheel, or how does it link to carbon? Stay tuned, because that's some of the new topics we're gonna dive into our next upcoming session later this year. And I'll leave Daniela to wrap it up with just our next activity at the Climate Week.
Yes. Thank you very much, Edith, and thank you everyone for joining. Just a final note from CPIC. So CPIC will be present with an event at Climate Week in New York City. We will be organizing a panel discussion around the topic of barriers and opportunities and new innovations to private capital finance flows into nature. So that will be essentially the topic of the panel. And afterwards, we will have a small networking session in person in New York City. So here is a save the date. More information will follow soon, but the event is meant to take place in New York City on the 21st of September. And I am now sending a link in the chat if you would like to register, and you can register to attend in person in New York, or just watch the live stream. And we'll be posting more information on this via our newsletter, which you can also subscribe to our website and on social media. So yes, I'm sending the link through now, and if you wish to attend the event, you can already register. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for all of you for sticking around for such a long time and over time. We will be sharing the presentation as well. Get in touch with Danielle if you'd like to get a copy, and look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thanks a lot. And thanks to all the speakers for the great presentations.
Thanks everybody for joining. Please join us in New York.
Thanks a lot.